So our first speaker in this session is André Dombrowski, who is an associate professor of art history at the University of Pennsylvania. His research centers on the art and material culture of late 19th century France and Germany, particularly the social and intellectual rationales behind the emergence of avant-garde painting in the 1860s and 70s. He has published extensively on artists such as Cézanne, Manet, Degas, Monet, Menzel, and other key painters of the period. His book, Cézanne, Murder and Modern Life, great title, was the recipient of the Phillips Book Prize in 2013. He's also co-editor of a new anthology called Is Paris Still the Capital of the 19th Century? Essays on Art and Modernity, 1850 to 1900, and the book The Image Affair, Dreyfus in the Media, 1894 to 1906. And he's now writing a book called Painting Time, Impressionism and the Modern Temporal Order, which looks at the intersections of Impressionist painting and the history of modern timekeeping. And his talk today deals also with Impressionism, but explores its relationship to emerging economic models of risk-taking. It is entitled Filiation and Affiliation, Impressionism LLC.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for that lovely introduction and for the invitation. And congratulations to you and your co-organizers. I think this has been a fantastic event, probably up until this very moment. So thanks for having me. I also want to, I need to thank a former student of mine, Pramit Kumar, who some years ago wrote a senior thesis on the topic of the Impressionists forming a limited liability company. He's a student from Wharton, actually, who came over into the history of art, and there are a lot of students coming from Wharton into my Impressionism class for obvious reasons, and I always think myself as enlightening them about aesthetic values and so on and so forth. In this case, he actually enlightened me about my rather probably uninteresting take on the economics of the Impressionist formation itself. So I really want to thank Pramit wherever he is right now. But so much. You will hardly need reminding that the 1860s and 1870s birthed a new kind of painting. As life in the 19th century sped up, technologized, and monetized, so it seems did the century's art. Painting in 15 minutes, and time is money after all. As one critic early on said, time is money after all. As the poet and critic Jules Laforgue called Impressionism in 1883, characterized a novel kind of picture engendered through sheer abbreviation and swiftness, such as this Monet of the Gare Saint-Lazare in Hanover. The Impressionist canvas was built of hectic signs. Some have even called them proto-pixelated to account for the fact that each brush mark now was independent and freed from the full burden of representation, only partly attached to the scene it depicted. Freewheeling brushstrokes encoded both the materiality of paint, so the story goes, and the abruptness with which it seemed to have been applied as well. Impressionism thus chronicled the profound cultural shifts of its era. Its blurs and unfinished appearance made movement and a particularly modern sense of speed its chief subject. No longer allegorical, time in Impressionism was now literal, just as we have literalized the monetary throughout the history of art and modernism. I think time too is literalized here, which is to say that it could be measured, right, in terms industry and capital both furnished and understood. Right? That's the power of the concrete and the literal, that industry can do something with it. It is this question that my book project I'm currently engaging, as Maggie said, tackles how the industrialization of time, the emergence of universal time, labor time, and so on, changed the key ingredient of the Impressionist picture, the instant, if you will. But today I want to think about with you how this brush unit, if you will, in the Impressionist picture is also, or should also be understood in financial and economic terms, how we can understand it as an allegory, if you will, of the period sense of money. In our established narratives of the rise of modern art in the late 19th century, the Impressionists' self-organized independent exhibitions, freed from state control, play a crucial role in the era's famous liberation of form from narrative and textuality. The group's independence is usually couched in terms of striving against the strictures of academic regulation that had begun decades earlier, coalesced in the 1860s, it is said, and finally breaking free by the early 1870s when the first independent Impressionist exhibition occurred in 1874. Here's the Nadar studio as it looks now, where that exhibition took place. In many art histories of Impressionism, still, the artistic avant-garde's demands for freedom were a matter of conflict largely between itself and the established artistic regimes like the Académie and the Salon. Stéphane Mallarmé put it famously in 1876. Quote him here, "The search after truth peculiar to modern artists, which enabled them to see nature and reproduce her, such as she appears to just pure eyes, must lead them to adopt air almost exclusively as their medium, or at all events to habituate themselves to work in it freely and without constraint." I hope by now you have heard me overuse the word free and freedom, and I want to, you will see that I'm concerned here with the particular nature of this aesthetic freedom, if you will, and the ways in which the words resonated and assimilated a rhetoric around economic liberalization in the 1860s and 70s, and this is really what I will focus on. So this liberation Mallarmé described of both artistic organization and form then has less often been seen as a mirror and perhaps even an effect, I want to see, of the French and European economic liberalizations of the 1860s, which the Impressionists, I think, quite directly mimicked and annexed to their cause. In this talk, I seek to understand then the avant-garde's liberalized and freed practices as an expression of the economic liberalizations of the 60s, and to see the Impressionists' new risky pictorial maneuvers and counter-establishment ways of assembling paintings less as an inner artistic development and more as a reflection of the broader cultural attitudes towards risk-taking, risk-sharing, and risk management, schooled by dramatic changes in financial structures, as well as the global reach and ever more abstract nature of capital itself. The Impressionist movement established very clear ties, as you will know, between the world of modernizing commerce and pictorial form. Degas painted scenes in cotton offices and at the stock exchange, while many of the Impressionism's first collectors, as has also often been noted, were of new money. They were large-scale publishers and the like. When discussing the possibility of an independent artistic organization in the early 1870s, the art critic Paul Alexis even demanded that, I quote him here, "like any other corporation, the artistic corporation," I think that's a really interesting formulation for the 1870s, the artistic corporation, to think of the whole artistic enterprise as a cooperative one, has much to gain by organizing immediately into a syndicate, end quote. And this is only one of the many direct invocations of the overlap between corporate 19th century corporate culture and artistic innovation, by now quite typical of the period. That finally, the Impressionists, and this is really the focus of my talk today, in December 1873 formed what is known as the Société Anonyme Coopérative à Capital Variable d'Artistes Peintres, Sculpteurs, Graveurs, in order to organize their first independent exhibition 5 months later, is often mentioned in the literature on the movement, but seldomly taken as a gesture carrying as much artistic as it does, of course, economic signification. Société Anonyme, or limited liability joint stock companies, and I have highlighted here on the first page of that first 1874 catalog the very name of the organization the group gave itself. though going back to the Napoleonic Code of 1807, had only recently in 1867, right, so only 7 years earlier, been freed from government authorization in France. So it had only been possible for 7 years to actually simply register your limited liability company without government authorization. And thus only had been a widely applied economic model for the past 7 years or so, during which their numbers rose quite exponentially. So the Impressionists were partaking in this economic trend, if you will. The Impressionists were thus at the forefront, not just in terms of style and subject matter, as we know, but in terms of the very way they organized their business association as well. To my knowledge, theirs is was the first artistic venture to collectivize in this particular manner in history. To this end, this paper puts forth the following propositions about the meanings of this economic choice. Number one, what is sometimes referred to as the free play of the signifier in Impressionism, as I said, the growing detachment between pictorial mark or brushstroke and the world it seems to capture in nothing but blurs, is a possible expression, even if refracted, of new forms of freer economic play on which it is based. Two, Impressionism's desire for a collectivized avant-garde rather than the kind of late romantic individualistic one of which Delacroix, Courbet, Manet, Cézanne, and so on were all a part of, seems to me a special stage of avant-garde culture, a collective avant-garde, based on new economic models of association and collective risk-taking. By borrowing languages and strategies then from the modern marketplace, the Impressionists managed perhaps to mitigate not just their own financial risks in staging this exhibition, but fostered a new market-sanctioned almost form of collective dissidence as well. In short, they borrowed the new ubiquity and security of changing business corporation models to mitigate the artistic risks they made palatable to their publics in their very pictures. So I'm interested in the fact that this aesthetic liberation and this aesthetic freedom, if you will, is based on economic security of the kind available to them, and there seems to me a concrete link there. The Impressionists selected a mode of economic organization then that placed them at the forefront of a new financial era of shared limited risks, which in turn mitigated, managed, and imaginatively controlled, I suspect, the risky business of their novel procedures of picturing. They rented the photographer's studio Nadar for their first exhibition located on the Boulevard des Capucines, as we know, a stone throw from the New Opéra and the Avenue de l'Opéra, and thus at the very heart of modern commercial and Haussmannized Paris, and also employed the newest economic form of organization for this first independent collective. Indeed, the Société Anonyme they founded matched their aesthetic demands quite closely with its minimizing of personal liability in case of financial failure, which, given the fact that the first exhibition was indeed not a success and resulted in monetary losses, probably proved a somewhat of a blessing in disguise. We all know that they were left at the end each to pay about 180 or 190 francs that they owed to Nadar and other financial backers, which is roughly at the time the price of one of their pictures. So it was not an insubstantial amount. While at the same time preserving independence from external state controls. It cannot be coincidental that the group's first deliberations about a possible formal association officially occurred in 1867. Right, so this is we can think of any other forms of artistic collectivizing and association, but this formal and formalized, formally registered association is new and interesting. after they had been again mass refused by the Salon exhibition of that year, 1867, precisely the same year when the structure of the Société Anonyme was fundamentally altered in France. So again, I think there is a concrete link there between the first mentioning of this group wanting to collectivize and this economic model becoming available exactly in the same year. That year, Frédéric Basile, among those artists refused by the Salon jury, wrote to his family in May 1867, speaking for the first time of an independently organized and funded exhibition venture. More lenient Salon jury and then the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune in 1870 and 71 obfuscated these plans for several years, but they were taken up again in 1873. From the evidence that remains, the potential form of their association was then newly pondered among the group. While Alexis demanded the establishment of a chambre syndicale, a kind of trade union, Camille Pizarro persuaded his colleagues to establish a Société Anonyme, instead basing its infamous founding charter on that of a recently established bakers' union in Pontoise with some changes. Here are the first three stipulations of the Société Anonyme they founded. I quote, Société Anonyme Coopérative with variable personnel and capital has formed between painters, sculptors, engravers, and lithographers for a period of 10 years, starting last December 27th, with the object of 1. The organization of free exhibitions without a jury or honorary awards where each partner can exhibit his or her work. 2. The sale of said work. It's actually quite interesting the sales agreements they made about amongst each other, because 10% of each sale that every painter is supposed to have in this exhibition, few things sold, so it didn't really matter that this clause existed, was to give 10% of their proceeds to the limited liability company. So there is this interesting co-equivalence established between all their pictures, if you will, and the amount of funds they needed to put into this pot. 3. The publication as soon as possible of a journal relating exclusively to the arts. End quote. Their new collective designation, right, Société Anonyme, then appeared on posters, catalog covers, and in many reviews, especially given the fact that the Impressionists was a label coined only during the first exhibition itself by a hostile critic and not before. So Société Anonyme is in many ways the originary Impressionist label. If you read through the reviews of the 1874 Impressionist exhibition, they are actually always called the Société Anonyme, the Société Anonyme, the Société Anonyme. And as you saw on the catalog cover by now as well, and I quite find this one caricature we have of the 1874 show quite interesting, right? Because here is this elegant Parisian woman who's carrying this poster on her back. Here it is a little bit blown up, but look at this tiny little detail, right? But Société Anonyme. So it's almost as if the designation didn't quite fit the size of the poster, right? And thereby entering some form of disagreement between promotion, label, language, and display, and so on. This is also an interesting case that I think comes from the equalization and equivalence that this model promoted between its members. This is a triptych that an 1870s collector established and had a Pizarro, a Monet, and a Sisley framed together in this particular way. I'm not going to ask you to identify which is which picture, right? But I think the problem is exactly an interesting one, right? That you have this is the Pizarro, this is the Monet, and this is the Sisley, but that you have a collective here, right? That on the basis of this economic shared economic model then builds an aesthetic that's actually rather similar, right? Where the pictures, the way of understanding and developing a new form of landscape painting is actually fairly equal among the members, right? And I think that the new forms of economic coexistence have an effect here on a shared stylistic sense as well. Some more background. Prior to the year 1800, largely two types of business associations were commonly practiced. And Nina, I need your help on this. The Société en nom collectif, a partnership with unlimited liability, and the so-called Société en commandite, a combination of unlimited liability managed by so-called gérants with limited liability for investors only. The 1807 Coup de Napoleon added a third model then to these possibilities that resembles today's corporations perhaps most closely, the so-called Société anonyme. But Article 37 of the Code ensured that any such incorporation needed government authorization. So you couldn't just open a limited liability company, you needed government authorization to do that, a process that was arduous and long-winded, resulting in success only in a few and mostly of the very large-scale enterprises of the period, such as railroads and so on, in which this model was first practiced. So it then took till 1867, right, as I've already said, that Article 37 was overturned, and the numbers of new Sociétés Anonymes spiked kind of immediately in the process. 798 of them were formed in Paris alone between 1869 and 1879, which is more than the 642 of them that had been authorized by the government in all of France between 1807 and 1867. Right? So that gives you just a bit of the numbers of the boom in this form of authorization. In the single year 1881, 976 Sociétés Anonymes were founded in France. So the Impressionists are in good company here, is what I'm saying. Right? They are making use of this new economic model and the freedom to register as a company, free of the need for government authorization, which obviously mirrors their own strive from freeing themselves from government oversight aesthetically. When in 1874 the Impressionists put Société Anonyme then so proudly at the top of the cover of their first catalogue, they did not just signal that they were painting new modern subjects in a new modern manner, but also organized socially and economically in the newest and most modern ways then available to them. Moreover, after May 1871, the Société Anonyme provided a context in which association for the express purpose of state-independent activity was sanctioned within a post-Paris Commune society, in which collectivity had, of course, connoted a sense of political and cultural danger. So an economic association, if you will, indeed allowed the Impressionists to circumvent some of the more negative and dangerous political connotations that independent collective action and activism still carried after a collective enterprise like the Paris Commune just a few years earlier. What is more, the cultural need to build into the social and economic structure itself a certain risk protection for innovation, exemplified by the redefinition and rising status of the Société Anonyme, became emblematic of the fact that innovation itself had become a strengthened value, which could be translated from the sphere of economics, I think, to that of aesthetics. But it also, of course, then produced a sense of aesthetic innovations of an insured and of a secured, if you will, kind. Right. So there's this interesting back and forth there, I think, that I'm interested in. Some paintings made during these years bear the results of these deliberations quite explicitly in their form. Degas' Cotton Office in New Orleans and his portraits at the Stock Exchange are perhaps the most expressly economic of modern life paintings, providing a direct image of the period's financial transactions. In 1869, Basile painted a group of his colleagues gathered in his studio, an informal gathering whose helter-skelter organization of figures strewn throughout the space evokes metaphorically, I think, the new liberties in association enabled by the new forms of business incorporation. And I'm partly referring here to Bridget Alstorff's work on association in this particular group, in Fontaine and around Manet in particular. And she does very beautiful formal readings of these pictures, is less interested in the kind of economic and political valences of association. So I'm trying to erase that as a point besides her interpretations. Most importantly, perhaps, and less iconographically determined, to come back to my initial point, the look of an Impressionist picture mirrors the form of the group's organization, I think, an assembly of separate brushstrokes hanging, belonging together without losing any of their individual status. No kind of painting before Impressionism had understood the single brushstroke as quite so liberated and separate, yet placed so deeply within a network of many collectively, if you will, outside of which the single unit would fail to signify. The new economic model of organization thus availed itself in part as a metaphor too of independent form and as an emblem of the freed signifier itself. Furthermore, when the Impressionists made the choice to form a Société Anonyme, France was, for a period of about 10 years following the 1867 law, at the forefront of a newly liberal European trade regulation, briefly surpassing England in their laissez-faire economics, of which the new Société Anonyme were the best expression. After several years during which many French businesses had actually decamped to England because of the mid-1850s deregulation of business incorporation there, the famous Limited Liability Act of 1855 and the Joint Stock Act of 1856, the 1867 law in France reversed that tide until the English laws were changed again too some years later. So it's quite interesting to think about, I think, in these years, the international competition between France and Germany. And obviously it's always said that Paris is the sort of cultural capital of the 19th century and London is the economic capital, but these processes are precisely being worked out in very specific legal and economic terms, and they are shifting partly here. So for a brief moment after 1867, and because of the Limited Liability Act in France, the tide was reversed briefly. That these developments mattered deeply to the course of modern art in both countries, I think, and the redefinition of modern artisthood as well is perhaps nowhere better expressed than by one of the first international groupings and associations in history. In 1859, Whistler, Fontaine-Latour, and Le Gros formed what they called the Société des Trois, and Société then, of course, also being a semi-veiled reference to the various business models then in practice, an informal grouping which they managed to sustain even after both Whistler and Le Gros had actually moved to England, enabled by the newly opened economic borders between the two nations by the Treaty of 1862. So you have here this interesting collective that's not yet as formalized and as registered as the Impressionists would be, but here are these three painters who are managing to sustain an association across borders between Paris and London and are organizing in this very manner. Here's Delacroix's homage to Fantin's homage to Delacroix, where some of them are figured, and Delacroix and Fantin is actually very interesting because he staffs these pictures according to who is currently in Paris, and he actually wants to put Legault in there, but he can't come because he's in London, and writes to him back and forth and tries to get him to come and so on. But so the kind of international tension and collaboration is sort of written deeply into the choice of figures that you see here. Chacun séparément très libre, a grouping of individuals, each free in their own right, despite association, is what Fantin Latour famously wrote to Whistler and Legault in 1863, again taking the language of limited liability and laissez-faire economics deeply into his own aesthetic sense. A statement he knew would cross the channel like any other good now trading more easily between the two countries. In the various large-scale group portraits of his colleagues, which Fantin produced in the 1860s and 70s, and again Bridget has written very nicely and beautifully about them, the changing conceptions of group identity and cross-channel travel ended up determining the compositions of his canvases and the choice of models, again depending on who's available. This talk is not meant then, or has not been meant, to reverse our usual priorities between art and commerce, nor would I want to put money before art, and I certainly refrain from a cruder Marxist definition of an artistic sphere based on the period's organization of capital, although I understand that my argument is veering in that direction, and I like it to nonetheless. Still, international commerce and competition, as well as free business incorporation, were one of the models on which the avant-garde could base its new types of aesthetic and artistic liberalization, modern collectivism, and artistic dissidence, and their degree of risk-taking in aesthetic form, both as a group and in their paintings. Artistic freedom is, after all, and by necessity, modeled on other forms and discourses of freedom then available to a culture, be they political or, in this case, economic. When it came to the avant-garde, the rhetoric of independence they developed mirrored that of French business quite closely, both in terms of chronology and terminology. To form a collective enterprise as ambitious artists at this moment then was not simply an act in clear contradistinction to the Academy, as I've said. It also signaled a complete reconfiguration of picture making, now understood less as finding one's place within a strictly pictorial tradition, but within a much wider culture of liberation, innovation, and management of risk as well. This fact in part also explains why the Impressionists were so often confused with political radicals and called intransigents early on, precisely because their form of dissidence seemed borrowed from other features of modern emancipation. True, the Impressionist Société Anonyme was dissolved less than a year after its founding. So much for the success of this story. And the group never quite returned to this economic model, even though it would organize 7 more independent exhibitions. So none of the 7 following exhibitions were based on this economic model after 1874. Nonetheless, the direct links between economics and association had been established and were there to stay. Only a few years later, in the 1880s, Monet, Renoir, Sisley and their colleagues would enter into the various business agreements with their first dealers, including Durand-Ruel, of course, and others, now famous in their own right, which obviated the need for business associations of the limited liability company kind with which they had started. And I'll leave it at that, and I thank you.